So I think the Cold War ends and the Soviet Union collapses, right? The Soviet Union collapses between 89 and 91, ends in late 1991. There's a big question you might remember at the time about the so-called peace dividend, right? What are you going to do? You created these hundreds of global bases. You have this massive defense budget because of the Soviet Union. So without the Soviet Union, it's the end of history. Fukuyama says liberal democracy is the only ideology. You should come home. But it turns out that over the course of those 4.5 decades, 45 to 89, let's say, 45 to 89-91, a bunch of interests were created, in the military industrial complex, defense contractors, but also think tanks, academic research centers, people like Condi Rice, who became Soviet specialists, who dedicated their lives and careers to this thing. Moreover, so you have the establishment of 4 decades long of interests, but you also have the creation of 4 decades long of ideology, where people believe that global peace and prosperity depends on the United States dominating the world. So what actually happens is that in the 1990s, the empire doesn't really recede, but you instead see the search for new logics of justification. For example, very early on, the Gulf War of 1991, Saddam Hussein is referred to, it's ridiculous, as Hitler and as an existential threat to the United States, which is just absolutely absurd from any objective perspective. It's ridiculous. The United States is overwhelmingly powerful, surrounded by 2 oceans, has an enormous amount of nuclear weapons, whatever. But I think what actually happens most interestingly is that in the search for the decades, you see this project of people trying to provide a new logic for empire through the idea of human rights. The U.S. doesn't intervene in Rwanda. The U.S. only intervenes in Bosnia late. So you see a new justification for American empire by people saying that the United States will serve as the global policeman and it will essentially end genocide. Concomitantly, I think, Glenn, I don't know your precise age, but you essentially see the boomers create a bunch of cultural products to justify the continuation of American empire. Schindler's List in 1993, Saving Private Ryan in 1998, right? They're returning to the stories of their fathers to justify the continuation of this empire by returning to the only good war, right? You don't get a lot of Vietnam things in the 1990s. You get a lot of World War II things because you see a justification for the American empire, and that justification is ending genocide. But I actually don't think that's that powerful. I think people are more concerned with their local communities and they're more concerned with what's going on. So what happens with 9/11, it is a gift to the American empire because now you're able to basically identify an ideological enemy, Islamic jihadism, Islamic radicalism, what have you, and you're able to pretend, because it is pretending, that this is an existential threat equivalent to the Soviet Union, a gigantic nuclear armed power, or Nazi Germany. So what you have, it's not a surprise if immediately after 9/11 you get all of these wars because you basically have the interests that I mentioned and the ideologies and the people that I talked about governing what the United States does, and that leads to 20 years in Afghanistan. If you think about Vietnam, we were there from 54 to 75, 21 years. Everyone's like, oh no, Vietnam syndrome. We do it again 25 years later. It's absolutely ridiculous. And so what you see now, we could talk about the war on terror, but what you see now is it's pretty clear to everyone that Islamic jihad is not a threat to the United States in any meaningful way. So now you have a return to great power competition and the identification of China, which I also think we're imposing a world-spanning vision on as an existential threat that is going to, again, as it always does, re-justify the continuation of this empire that does almost nothing for ordinary Americans. And in fact, I would add, destroys the world.
I love your passion, Daniel. Your students must really get a charge out of hearing you lecture about these things. And again, I have to confess my relative ignorance, so my pushback is going to be feeble at best. There will be people out there saying, how come you didn't ask him this, and how come you didn't say that? I want to say a couple of things. So oil, I just want to hear what you have to say. Oil. So here's how I understood, as a non-expert, what happened in the first Gulf War, which was that Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait that couldn't be allowed to stand. I am sure there's an elaborate, justification or account of why it is that couldn't be allowed to stand. And that had to be set right. And so it was set right. It was a limited action. We didn't remove Saddam Hussein. We just simply expelled him from the Kuwaiti oil fields. Now, I thought there was such a thing as real national interest, and that the security of the supply of oil to the global capitalist hegemon or, machine, and I'm talking about in Western Europe, I'm talking about in East Asia, I'm talking about in North America, needed to be stood for. And that's not, what's the point in being a global power if you can't protect your interests, et cetera? So that's what I thought. I'm worried about you, Daniel. You came right up to the edge of saying that you didn't say it, and I don't know that you believe it, and I'm not imputing it to you, but it was an inside job. You say we were lucky. I mean, we boomer elites who have gotten used to a Cold War and a global American footprint, we're lucky to have an excuse to carry this forward. But what I want to say is, come on, man. The guy that made Schindler's List, you know who I'm talking about.
Spielberg?
Yeah, he wasn't in on it. Not on 9/11. He wasn't on the project. He was just responding, was he not, to his artistic impulses, to whatever funding opportunities and there might have been in the Hollywood machine, and to what was perceived to be a market for a commercial product out there. Surely it's a more complicated story than we just wanted to have an excuse to keep the machine oiled and globally footprinted, to ask about what that generation's, that's the Archie Bunker generation, isn't it? I mean, Anyway, so it sounded like a tail wagging the dog to try to explain American popular artistic products with with that kind of an account. But anyway, we are complicit in the perpetuation of an ideologically governed narrative about the need for American power that is clearly at odds with reality. Global war on terrorism is a fraud.
Yes. Made a lot of people a lot of money. I think that with the art question, I think that's very interesting because I think you're right. The story, if I was writing a book about Schindler's List, it wouldn't just be that, that it was part of this larger structural force. But as a historian, I ask why the explosion in Holocaust and World War II memory right after the Cold War ended. Right. That to me is the question, the research question that I am.
Do you know
I'm
this
interested
book? Excuse me. You know this book by McNeil, the historian at Chicago? I think it's The Holocaust in American Life.
Yeah,
I the guy's name.
No, I think, is that Finkelstein? No, that's Peter Nozick.
No,
he's the guy who wrote. He recently passed away.
Novick.
No, not Robert Nozick. Peter Novick, who recently passed away, wrote the best book about the historical profession, titled "That Noble Dream." But yes,
and you don't like the Holocaust in American Life?
No, it's a good book. I think it's right. I think that's right. I think that's a long story going back, but when we're just talking about the 90s and the end of history, I think it's interesting that there's the return to the founding moment of history and the founding moment of American hegemony by the children of the people who created that order. It's not the only thing, but I think it's an important and telling element. Band of Brothers.
Well, I use that as an example of my point and I'm talking to you and you're the expert, that it's complicated, and that, as I recall Novick's book, which I read years ago, the Jewish leadership were reluctant to, in the immediate post-war, high Cold War McCarthyite period, were reluctant to make a big deal out of the Holocaust. They were under a sort of strategic calculation about how to manage the public image and interest of the American Jewish community at that particular moment in history where the Cold War was just getting ramped up. So, he reports about business fairs where German companies would be feted in New York City, and Jewish dignitaries would actually acquiesce in that sort of thing, even though they know these guys have been selling raw material to the Wehrmacht because they didn't want to seem to be commies, No,
absolutely. He's right. And it's not until Eichmann, the Eichmann trial, that Holocaust memory begins to enter American life, and then you have moments like Shoah. I think then we get into the particular representations of these cultural products and how they shift over time. And I would say the heroic character of the 1990s cultural products, as opposed to the the banality of evil is a very complex idea. Saving Private Ryan is not necessarily as complex, and neither is Schindler's List. And so then I think you look at the character, the qualitative character of these cultural products, and see how they change over time for particular purposes. Unconscious.
Okay.
Spielberg is not doing this. And I do not think 9/11 was an inside job whatsoever. There was intelligence failures. There were failures to act that have been, reported by the most mainstream of sources. But I don't think it was an inside job by any stretch of the imagination.